This is a presentation of the WELS Historical Institute and Friends of the Salem Landmark Church Museum. Welcome to the third in the 2010 summer series of Great Sermons of the Past. Seeker, Walter, and now, these final sermons by Dr. S.C. YLVISAKER and Professor Karl LAWRENZ reflect on the inter-synodical turmoil of the period from 1932 to 1961. Historical settings and sermon excerpts are presented by Dr. Mark Braun, author of A Tale of Two Synods. In the Salem Landmark Church, birthplace of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod in 1850, the building is presently being restored.
Dr. Mark Braun.
Thank you for having me here today. This is really a wonderful thing. This is what I, when I was on the board, dreamed about, but frankly, I didn't know how I would get from where we were to there. And I'm really grateful for the new insurgence of people with an interest in this, and some who have experience with working with a historical building and a group to put this together. So this is really wonderful. So thank you for having me. What I'm going to talk about today are two sermons. One of them by a Norwegian Synod professor. I'm not exactly sure of Professor YLVISAKER's position, if he was president of Bethany, if he was president of the Norwegian Synod, and I'm sure that there would be any number of you here who might know that history better than I do. And the other, just a portion of a sermon that President Karl LAWRENZ preached for the opening of school at the seminary in 1961, the first school year that was beginning after the split came. It is not easy to find many sermons that were preached regarding the relationship between the Missouri and Wisconsin synods as things deteriorated in the 1940s and 50s. I'm sure they were preached, and I'm sure that in some cases they had a significant effect on how individual members saw this conflict, but they probably didn't enter into print. Many pastors, many of whom have now gone to heaven, many of them at the time in the late 1990s shared with me the homemade things that they put together in order to try and inform their congregations about what was happening. And it brought back memories of spirit masters and mimeograph machines and all these kind of this copying that we don't do anymore. So a lot of that has been lost to history. But I think one of the points I want to make here is that as we go along, in some ways, the effort to inform congregations and to speak publicly about the circumstances was one of the last, or one of the later steps to come as this unfolded. The disagreements remained a pastor's disagreements for some time. And it was felt that those areas of concern would be resolved, and that they would be done on the level of the pastoral conference or the district convention. It was a conscious decision, as we'll see, to even bring this to a place where it would be discussed on the congregational level and in more publicly. So that's really where I want to go. So I tried to give you something of a chronology, and I certainly would still hawk my book to say, if you want to read all about this. I ended up going back to remind myself of some of the stuff I found years ago. But it was a challenge in doing my research on this to get the chronology in line. I think those who lived through this did not have a difficulty with this. But when you come along later, it was necessary to line things up in order to see, because there was always, at any given time, one church body had just said something and everybody was waiting for the other's response. And when you were in the middle of the game, you were very clear always what the score was. So I tried to recreate some of this, and let's just pick 1932 as good a date as any to start. In 1932, the Missouri Synod published in English something called the brief statement. Maybe you're familiar. It is actually this, we believe, in the Wisconsin Synod is modeled after this. There had been attempts in the 19-teens and 20s to bring the various Midwestern Lutheran synods together, and it came really quite close. And when it failed, the Missouri Synod said that it should publish a pamphlet which would clearly say what that church body believed, and in the future, any possibilities of joining with other Lutherans could be done only on the basis of whether those other Lutherans agreed to the brief statement. If you have not ever seen or read the brief statement, let me just say that you'd be very much at home with it. I mean, the Wisconsin Synod is still very much a brief statement synod. Also, 1932 is a good place to pick, just because there happened to be a report in, I believe, the Northwestern Lutheran, which described the 1932, that summer's synodical conference meeting. The synodical conference met every even-numbered summer, and they had representatives from the four bodies: Missouri Synod, by far the biggest, then Wisconsin, then the Norwegian, which is now the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and the Slovak Synod. And this was much like the House of Representatives. They had the delegates based on the size of the church body, so Missouri always had the dominant sized contingency there. But the 1932 report is flowery in excess about what a wonderful fellowship everybody enjoyed. From the papers given, to the worship, to the conversations in the hallway, to the food, to the buildings, to the weather, a good time was really had by all. And you read this knowing what happened less than 20 years later. And it even for someone who didn't live through it like I did, it gives one a sense of sadness that this close relationship deteriorated so rapidly, I would say, and to such a degree. So what were some of the steps that happened along the way? In 1935, both the newly formed American Lutheran Church, the ALC, and the longer established Eastern Lutheran LCA, Lutheran Church in America, both made overtures to the synodical conference churches like the Missouri and Wisconsin Synod, whether they would like to once again enter into conversations to see if they could establish a pan-United States Lutheran Union. And Missouri did respond to that and began to have conversations, its representatives, with the representatives of the ALC. And it probably should be mentioned that the ALC was formed in 1930 and was made up of the Buffalo Synod, the Iowa Synod, and the Ohio Synod. So this was, first of all, a Midwestern regional emphasis, and that they had come close to coming to fellowship. So it wasn't that the ALC making this offer was a complete offer out of the blue, but it was something which came from people that in many cases they knew of quite well. In 1938, the Missouri Synod said that the brief statement, which they had developed in order to carry on doctrinal discussions toward union, together with the ALC declaration of the representatives of the American Lutheran Church, should be regarded as the doctrinal basis to form future church fellowship between the Missouri Synod and the American Lutheran Church. This was immediately suspect by the on the part of the Wisconsin Synod and the Norwegian Synod for a couple of reasons. One is that for some reason, which always remains a matter of intrigue, the Wisconsin Synod never got an invitation the way the Missouri Synod did to even be part of this talk. And even today, we sometimes hear people say it's easier to get forgiveness than it is to get permission. Was there on anybody's part a sense that Wisconsin wouldn't have wanted to come anyway, so why invite them? However anybody may have felt about that, because the synodical conference was a group of synods working together, any invitation to one should have been an invitation to all. The other concern Wisconsin had, which makes perfect sense, is that you can't say you've come to an agreement based on two separate documents which do not quite agree. I'm sure that you could never solve a crisis between labor and management if each had their own contract with different salary terms, but we've come to an agreement. So Wisconsin said in 1939 in convention that we have to have one document which states what the churches believe and what they also reject, that both Missouri, Wisconsin, and the ALC would all accept. Over the next 20 years, 3 tries were made to come up with a document, and in the end, nobody liked any of those 3 documents. But already there was a sense in Wisconsin and the Norwegian Synod, is there something that's changing here between us? Now in 1941, I should say, and I'm not sure I understand this history exactly correctly, but when the representatives of the ALC and the Missouri Synod met together, they were beginning to have the practice of opening or closing these meetings with joint prayer. And the long-standing belief of the Synodical Conference had been that prayer is an expression of a shared faith together of groups already in doctrinal agreement and in fellowship. And at times Missouri and Wisconsin had not prayed with leaders of other church bodies when they were having a meeting to try to bring about fellowship. In fact, that was a pretty major issue in 1904, 1905, 1906. It appears that there was a discussion on the floor of the 1941 Missouri Convention about whether that was the proper thing to do, to pray together as if fellowship had already been established, when that was the entire purpose of their meeting, was to bring it about. And apparently, although the convention reaffirmed its belief that meetings like this should be open and closed with prayer and worship only after agreement in doctrine has been established, it appears that a statement was made on the floor that, as it says here, it says, although prayer fellowship generally involves church fellowship, there may be cases where the question whether common prayer means fellowship belongs in the field of casuistry. That statement might be true as it stands, and certainly it can be true among individuals who may decide in a personal situation that they would like to have the opportunity to strengthen that faith relationship, and even though all issues aren't resolved, regard the person as a weak but interested believer and pray with them. But apparently that concession stood, so that in 1944, Missouri said, joint prayer at inter-synodical conferences asking God for his guidance and blessing shall be acceptable, provided that the prayer does not imply denial of the truth or support of error. Local conditions will determine the advisability of such a prayer. So this is really a change from what had been done in the past. The way this was sometimes put colloquially is that there's a difference between prayer fellowship and prayer witness. Imagine if I went to a meeting that had representatives from many other churches, and I would take my turn in the front praying, not necessarily assuming that I prayed with them, but praying in front of them and using my prayer as a statement of faith. That would not be an expression of a shared faith. It might be a testimony, but in its probably worst form example, you could, under this context, pray with a Roman Catholic priest as long as he didn't offer the prayer through the saints. So Wisconsin and the Norwegian Synod were again saying, there is a difference here, isn't there? Which Missouri not only was not acknowledging, but in some cases even saying, well, there is something of a difference, and we're actually returning back to the way we used to be back in Walther's day, which was also not accepted by everybody. The other thing which probably hit the parishes and the average members much more closely is that in 1944 the Missouri Synod reversed its opposition to its members belonging to the Boy Scouts. And the Boy Scouting issue the scouting issue sounds like a trivial kind of issue today. It's hard with college students today even to get them to appreciate any of the issues involved, because it is a different world today. But the fact that the opposition to scouting was so unpopular with people and really quite difficult to explain in some ways to people, and because there were many fine, upstanding men who were willing to be leaders of boys and women of girls in scouting, it was a really unpopular stand to take. And if there was one thing that reassured the Wisconsin Synod, it said, well, our big sister Missouri is taking the same stand. And what the Synod, excuse me, what the Wisconsin Synod, at least officially, did not know was that behind the scenes Missouri had been changing its mind about this for about a decade. So that this came as something of a shock, and it was very public. Following 1944, there were instances in which the Missouri Synod opened new congregations in neighborhoods where there were Wisconsin churches, and one of their selling points was, we'll let your kids be scouts. And even though some of those things happened 40 years before, some of the retired pastors I talked to about that, you could still see the veins in their neck kind of expand and their eyes get wide as they talked about how really frustrating this was. And then the following year, a minor little blurb appeared in the Lutheran Witness which said that the Missouri Synod had the third highest number of scout troops in its congregations of any Lutheran group in the country, and had this high number, which meant that either they developed hundreds of new scout troops in the 8 months since the resolution was passed by the Synod, or, far more likely, that they'd tolerated scouts for decades. And when this came out, Pastor William Schaefer, who was the editor of the Northwestern Lutheran, wrote this it's one long, formless paragraph that covers the entire left column and part of the right. The editors at Northwestern broke it into paragraphs to make it look better, but that wasn't how it looked, where he just said, we are hurt, we are shocked, we are unspeakably opposed to this. How could they do this to us? But what this was forcing, what things like this were forcing to occur, was that this conversation, which the pastors and pastoral leaders wanted to keep on the level of pastors' conferences and other kinds of professional discussions, were now going to come into the public. And in 1947, there must have been a specific decision that was made by the editors of the Northwestern Lutheran, together with the district presidents and the synod president, that now we are going to have to start talking about this. And that's where this article about a time to be silent, a time to speak came out. And for those of you who remember living through that, following this article, there was rarely an issue of the Northwestern Lutheran that did not talk about this, even though all of the rest of life went on. Now that's kind of a long background setting to the parts of the first sermon that I want to talk about. As I said, the Synodical Conference meeting met every even-numbered summer, and they had a representative there based on the size of the church body. So I think Missouri had more representatives there than all the other three churches combined. And as it happened, at the opening address in 1950, the president, who was a Wisconsin Synod pastor, Pastor Schlueter, was unable to give the opening address. And so to take his place was, as this says, Reverend S.C. YLVISAKER, Ph.D. He filled in at the last moment. And what he said was kind of a bombshell, simply because he was talking out in public with lay delegates there about what everybody knew was happening. And what he said was clearly the viewpoint that was supported by Wisconsin and the Norwegian Synod and was not supported by Missouri. So I want to read you some segments of this. It's a little dark for me here, so I may have to stumble a couple times. But he used as his text Genesis 22, verse 1, which is, sometime later, God tested Abraham. And he says, and he has a paragraph or two about the story itself, and then he says, our synodical conference has been singularly blessed. The promises of God have been many, and they have been sure. Now it would seem as if God would lead us to Moriah, to test and try the faith of his children as of old. And with a certain feeling, at least, of uneasiness, our gaze turns to the brotherhood, to the conditions, confessionally and spiritually, that exist among us, as we ask ourselves in the sight of God, is this what God has built, what he has willed, what he has planted? Is ours the doctrine God has taught? Ours the unity his Spirit has willed? Do we look to man-made aims, or does the glory and pleasure of God alone guide our every way? And then he he goes a couple of paragraphs here, and then it says, thus also in other matters, we are in the habit of speaking of sin and grace and truth and love, and then easily forget that these heavenly things are as nothing, unless they consist not in words merely, but in realities, which are felt in hearts and lives that are moved by the Spirit of God. In all of this, we so easily speak and think and do, satisfied so long as we can keep within the sphere of generalities, but fearful lest we go beyond and become more specific. And yet it is characteristic of a true and sincere brotherhood that frankness prevail in all things. Generalities have no place where a definite sickness is involved. It is not possible to cure the body unless the specific tumor or infection or diseased area has been discovered and laid bare. Granted what we all know, that difficulties and dissensions have arisen among us, that the whole body is fast being threatened. If you were the physician called upon to diagnose, where would you say that the trouble lies? In what area is the infection? In which doctrine or practice are we being tempted and tested? And to what does God point specifically so that we may be restored to our former health? Now I'm thinking, I think in general, conferences in those days were attended with far more seriousness than they are today, for a number of reasons. One of them, perhaps simply, is that people were more polite in those days. Maybe that's the easiest one. Another is that there were not multiple forms of communication, so that when people came to conventions, they were hearing things for the first time in a lot of cases. Today, of course, we have things emailed and faxed, and it's all online, and conventions often become largely a dog and pony show. But also, conventions were taken seriously because these issues were very central to their continued existence. So you've heard his sermon so far where he said we have got to stop just being vague and having generalizations here. So then he said, there are three special areas where it is apparent that God is tempting us in the doctrines of unionism, of prayer, and of the church and the ministry. And then he devotes a paragraph to each one. He says, and I'll give you especially the one about unionism, because I think that's the strongest. As to the doctrine of unionism, let no one say that this difficulty is one that affects only one synod. All of us will grant that the appeal of closer recognition of and association with other Lutherans with whom we are not agreed doctrinally is a strong appeal. For these groups include many a relative and friend whom we love dearly. But let those who would carry this wish through to actual accomplishment ask the old question: can two walk together except they be agreed? Let them examine the Word of God and ask whether that Word permits us to recognize those as brethren in the one holy faith who would fellowship us of the Synodical Conference, and at the same time fellowship those who even boast that they are disagreed with us. Shouldn't have looked up. That was a mistake. In the history of these doctrinal discussions, there are developments that disquiet us. Can we afford to leave out antitheses which formerly were considered so important in clearing away misunderstandings and errors? Is it safe in formulating union theses to use fewer words, quote fewer Bible texts, include fewer points of difference? We are being tempted to discontinue the use of expressions that have reached confessional standing among us, as if the mere sound of them would give offense, and the offense might be avoided by dropping the offensive words. Again, we are tempted to disregard the historical background of inter-synodical disagreements, as if by the mere adoption of a resolution, the present can be commanded to forget the past, or the man made to forget his youth. For as a child learns by the study of his youthful past, and as a nation learns by the review of its past, so a church grows stronger by a steady avoidance of the pitfalls of the past, and by a steady testing of the ground upon which it stands. Do we grant that a strife has arisen among us between those who would eliminate and shorten and neglect the lessons of the past, and those who with meticulous care would retain and learn and remember? The history of the church teaches that it is the unionist who forgets the past, and the lessons of the past. It is the unionists who would shorten and generalize and confuse. It is and then number two, in the matter of prayer and the testing that has come to us in that area too that concerns us. Who of us is not tempted to deal in this doctrine as it would seem that circumstances dictate? All of us are tempted to ask, should not considerations that we easily regard as brotherly and charitable prevail in all our doings? Have we a right to say that one who confesses Christ is not one with him we can and should pray? In joint prayer, after all, any more than a request on the part of two or three or more that the God whom we confess should do what he has promised to all? But thus God tests and tries us again. He drives us back to the sacred scriptures, that we might investigate and discover whether we in this are faithful servants. The word of God was too plain and could not be misunderstood. It was too powerful in his life, and he could do no otherwise, as Luther said. And this is the way the tone of the rest of the sermon goes, until he comes to the conclusion. We have been frank and open in all of this. There is no other way if we seek a genuine cure. And we must, even at this convention, go aside into the privacy of God's presence and let him show us from Scripture the way that is right, even if this lead to Moriah and the slaying of beloved ambitions and hopes. As Abraham needed to discover that the promise of God was not so dependent on the human Isaac that he could not be sacrificed, so we must learn that we must be ready to sacrifice every human ambition. Yes, confess that man is nothing, that God may be all in all. And it is in this that our synodical conference can itself be blessed and become a blessing to and among the Lutheran as well as other churches of the world. Our conference has, since its beginning in the 1870s, been a bulwark and a strong fortress among the churches by one thing alone, by faithful adherence and loyalty to the Word of God. Numbers, popularity, nothing of this will gain for us the end we seek and for which our conference was established, the favor of God. But in faithful adherence to the Word lies God's favor, and in that will be found also the kind of success by which men will be blessed. Let us not win that we may lose, but lose that we may keep what God has, in his mercy has given. Now you see there on the back page that Professor Frederick of the seminary talks about this. I think he was there. But what he was actually doing was reviewing a collection of sermons in which this one was, I think, the lead sermon. And he said, the conference is, he gives a little bit of the background there, and he says, it certainly came as a shock to many then when YLVISAKER took the podium and delivered a polemical attack on the conference, especially on the Missouri Synod, for failing to come to grips with the doctrinal issues which confronted it. His address was surprising enough so that one representative, a former colleague, vocally objected from the galleries at the conclusion of the speech. You don't often get objections to the sermon, but maybe that means people were really listening. Those at Fort Wayne for that convention in 1950 will never forget the man and the address. Now maybe the most interesting part is that this is published, the sermon is published in the Synodical Conference Proceedings. But here's the note, which is at the end of the sermon, which is an even smaller print, so I hope I make it here. Note, Dr. YLVISAKER declared before the convention that the above address had not been submitted to the other officials of the Synodical Conference for approval, but that it has presented his individual opinions. On recommendation by the Standing Committee on Inter-synodical Relations, the convention resolved to attach the following statement to the presidential address. Missouri Synod members of the Committee on Inter-synodical Relations are not in agreement with some of the opinions in the presidential address. I read somebody once who said, God give us brave pastors, and God give us members willing to heed what they say. Because sometimes when we ask for a brave pastor, we're not so sure that we like what we get, or we're not so sure that we appreciate what he said. This must have been, certainly this was the signal to increased tension at the Synodical Conference meetings. The reports about 1952, 1954 are really distressing reports. Speakers being shouted down or hooted at, block voting. By 1954, the Synodical Conference had 2 separate opening services. Can you imagine a group that exists because it recognized that it agreed in teaching and practice, having 2 separate opening services? I mean, Rodney Dangerfield tells some, sad jokes about marriage. He says, we what did he say one time? He said, we work different shifts, we take separate vacations, I don't know what else to do to keep our marriage together. And I mean, that's really a sad kind of a statement, and it appears that's what was happening by the 1950s, how this had changed. Well, on the back here, I have some of the steps, and of course, again, this greatly simplifies, but I hope helps to put in some chronological order what happened. In 1953, Wisconsin declared itself in a state of protesting confession. And again, to use the illustration of marriage, this would be something like a trial separation, in that we're still married and we'll still recognize the legal and familial obligations, but we are struggling, and if we were dating, we would never move forward. But we're going to stay and work harder just because of the past. 1955, which was probably the most momentous and debated convention in Wisconsin history, and some people would say, we're still not exactly sure what happened, and I have a long part about that in the book. But essentially, the Wisconsin Synod, by resolution, recognized Missouri to be a persistently erring church body, which is Wisconsin's somewhat unique language to picture what Romans 16 talks about, where to mark those who habitually cause divisions and offenses. But Wisconsin said, we will hold, they didn't use the language hold in abeyance, but they would wait until the next chance that Missouri would be in convention for its response, as a kind of an act of understanding and love, and Missouri wasn't going to meet again until 1956. That set in motion some other problems within the Wisconsin Synod. In 1957, it came to a vote at the convention in New Ulm. The floor committee on church union recommended to the delegates that they vote to break with Missouri. The vote came to the floor and failed by 16 votes. And by then, numbers of, again, sincere pastors acting on the basis of their consciences believed that they could no longer remain with the Wisconsin Synod if it could allow. Their difficulty was to say, how can you call something sinful behavior but then allow people a certain amount of time to discontinue it? And they became the Church of the Lutheran Confession. By 1960, the issue was crystallized as being as regarding church fellowship. And the statement was made, do you regard fellowship as steps on a ladder, that the more you find yourself in agreement, the more various actions of church fellowship can you do together? This would be like praying with all people, going to communion with some, and being willing to preach in another church with even fewer. Or do you see all expressions of church fellowship as kind of a one or either you are or you aren't, which is what Wisconsin today calls the unit concept. Missouri said A, Wisconsin said B, so then it was clear. So then it just required the next time when the Synod and Convention would vote, which they did in 1961. And as reported in the Milwaukee Sentinel the next morning, we have gone the long, this is what Werner Franzmann, the chair of the floor committee in Wisconsin, said, we have gone the long mile of Christian love with the Missouri Synod, with the course and kind of admonition we have given until now. Today, a sterner kind of admonition and love is required. And the whole Franzmann story, the fact that Martin Franzmann had left our college in Watertown and had gone to teach in St. Louis before any of these things were coming to a head, and the fact that Missouri often sent Martin Franzmann to our Synod conventions and asked him to plead for patience and not to break. And then the fact that Wisconsin responded by making his brother Werner the chairman of the floor committee of the Wisconsin Synod. The picture of Martin being at one microphone on the gym floor at Wisco and Werner at the other. I guess I would call it heartbreaking in the memories of many people who saw that. And I got a letter at the time from the third brother in the family, Gerhard, who said that was the hardest thing he ever watched. He says, they were both my brothers, I love them both. Now, something that is occurring at the same time is, of course, you've got seminary students in Mequon each year when all of this is going on. And I don't know the degree to which it was policy to leave this out of the classroom conversations. I'm sure that students, even at the seminary level, know that if they can get the professor onto a different subject, then if they didn't do their homework, they're a little bit safer. But I'm sure there were many discussions outside of class. I came across in several of the files of the minutes and meetings of the what was then called the Church Union Committee, discussions and advice to be given to seminary students if they found themselves in difficult situations. Many of them in the late 1950s were going out and assisting, doing part-time vicar work, preaching in Missouri Synod churches in the area. And yet, you know, some of them had issues of conscience, it was difficult to know what to do. And so this happens on August 17th. The new school year is going to start in less than a month. And I don't know exactly whether some students came back and found that some of their classmates weren't there. I don't know if the decision was that abrupt for some of them. At Northwestern in Watertown, two of the professors were no longer on the faculty as of that 1961 decision. And it appears that both of them had certainly, it wasn't a secret, so they certainly had the inclination this was coming and had prepared for that, and both went to the Missouri Synod. But in the opening sermon that President LAWRENZ preached, most of the text was not a text pointed at any issue like this. And the sermon was, I would say, largely what one would expect from an opening service. But I want to come to the very last, one of the last paragraphs, maybe about the third of the end. Also entering the ministry in the midst of our synod at this time will involve very special vexations and difficulties. In faithfulness to the Lord's word, our synod has at this time found it necessary to sever a fellowship relation in which it has stood for many decades, and in which it has jointly carried out the proclamation of the gospel. This rupture will create many new problems for our young pastors going out into the field at this time. Over against outsiders, it will mean bearing the cross of being identified with a church body whose action and position will not be a popular one, or one that will generally be appreciated and understood. But also in their very field of labor, this rupture will mean coping with many difficult situations. Situations which will require a special measure of evangelical tact and judgment, and a great measure of patience and forbearance with misunderstandings, unclarities, and criticisms. On the one hand, it is a situation that will make it necessary to be all the more on guard against slipping into methods and procedures that are rigoristic and legalistic, a danger that is always there just when we are much concerned and seek to be conscientious. All this should instill a special note of earnestness into your seminary training at this time, and cause you to desire to gain deep personal convictions from Holy Scripture concerning the positions that you will ultimately be expected to uphold as you go forth into the ministry. We are all inclined to say sometimes when we hear preaching that we hope the preacher practices what he preaches. And there is no man I could ever think of that when he talks about having patience and bearing with people when they are slow to understand, nobody had the patience that Karl LAWRENZ had. And I can say that because I've read a few of his letters where he went on to almost exhausting care to try and make sure that what he was saying was being understood without ever trying to simplify or make easy rules. But I try to put myself in the position of a seminary student who is just coming to school then, or who is maybe just got out that summer, and the extra difficulties that would be upon him because he would be trying to explain this and be patient with people when such a dramatic shift came for many people. Allegiances would be changed, families would be split, I had one classmate at seminary who had been at Concordia at that time. He was a second career person. And he said, in my family for 2 generations, Concordia was the place to go. And overnight, during that summer, it became the worst place to go. And many times, of course, these issues got exacerbated and became personal. But his advice here was certainly lovingly given and sound, and I think he was very well aware of the additional burden that this was putting on these new young pastors and students coming into school. And it's made me think about, as I put on the bottom here, is what has happened a half century later. And this is my take, and you can disagree with it if you think it doesn't have it correct. My sense is that by and large, the pastors who went through the break with Missouri and were, let's say, mature pastors at the time it happened, with some experience and judgment, by and large understood the issues, even the gray issues. And even though you had men who voted to break fellowship with Missouri, they were people who loved the Missouri Synod in many cases, who had family there, and who did this with a great heavy heart and did not write them off with terrible terms like, liberal or whatever. I do think, however, that for some people that went through that, it got personal, because they just saw people on a different side. And I have, for example, a copy of a letter that was sent from one pastor to another, essentially sponsoring him as the sponsor of his children in baptism. And it's a pretty difficult letter to read. So it got personal. My sense is that the generation of people that President LAWRENZ was talking to and about, as a group, became cautious to the extreme. If there's any question whether what I'm doing or being asked to do might be misconstrued as fellowship, I'm going to stay away from it. Every third year, we try to have a conference with the faculty of Bethany, MLC, and us, and then they put us off into disciplines, so all the religion teachers were together, and somehow in the course of the conversation, somebody made a comment about, a group that thinks you have to be in fellowship in order to have a basketball tournament together, and can we, like everything is fellowship. And there was a little bit of laughter from some of the younger people, and one of the men there said, I got out of seminary in 1965, and this was not easy then, because we had to be concerned so much about what other people interpreted our actions to be. And so even when I hear stories about WELS pastors who have done things which appear to be remarkably cold, and you almost think sometimes that they are caricatures, I think that was born in an over strong sense of caution not to go too far the other way. I think I was coming out of seminary in 1978, just at about the time that was beginning to change a bit, and that it was becoming a bit more allowable if our pastors or professors could work together with others as long as it was clearly delineated that there would not be activities expressing church fellowship. Can we, for example, work on a curriculum, on translating the Bible, on collecting hymns, on rewriting worship, liturgy, so long as we are not worshiping together? But that was by no means agreed upon by all. And just to tell a personal story, the first year in my ministry, one of the young women in our congregation was elected the Blossom Queen, which may not sound like much of an honor, but this was Southwest Michigan, the great fruit country, and every little town had its Blossom Queen. And then they'd have the Blossom Queen celebration, and our young lady won. And so her manager, came to me and said, we would like you, we're going to have a luncheon with all of these girls and their parents and sponsors. And we were wondering if you as her pastor would like to come and give the opening invocation. And this is the dilemma, I think, that whether out of kindness or naivety, young pastors just feel bad about ignoring altogether, because this is their girl. And yet they don't want to be, leading in prayer and assuming agreement with all kinds of people who may believe anything or nothing. And so I ended up that I went, and I was able to make something of a statement about this beautiful part of the world that we live in, so richly blessed by God. But that also, that, Kathy was the girl's name, Kathy and we in our church, as I'm sure in many of your churches, has a far more beautiful message about an even more wonderful life in the next life, which Jesus has given us. And then I feel it would be presumptuous of me, however, to pray for you. And so I'm going to allow just a moment where you can pray as you wish. And I'm pretty sure hardly anybody understood why I did that. And I'm not sure that I would do that again. The easy thing would have been not to go. But I think there was, after 20 years, a growing sense of, well, can we just be so separate from the world that we can't do that? And I'm just afraid what that's yielded to is a third generation that is less agreed on this, where you, I think, have some pastors in some churches that will regard almost any activity, whatever, together with people to be a violation of church fellowship. And I have read papers and heard presentations where people said that they even advised, they couldn't use a Bible passage to prove it, but they advised that people not even have social friendships outside the synod. That is a kind of quarantine which I think is impossible to maintain and unloving at the same time. On the other hand, I think the fact that the world and the United States has gotten so much more diverse and with an influx of many more religions, with the fact that evangelicalism has become so much more popular, which tends all through its history to kind of agree on a few basic things and let the rest disagree. And our people are strongly affected by evangelicalism. It's optimism, it's understandable messages, it's practicality, it's music. That it is, I think we have a generation that certainly of members, and maybe to some degree even a higher number of pastors who simply have no real recollection of this past and just inherit memories of it without getting at it organically, if I can put it that way. And I don't know what this means for the future. I'm always surprised when people tell me, I read your book and I enjoyed it, because I don't think it's the kind of book one can finally enjoy. At least it's not, it isn't that they all lived happily ever after. It certainly is true that the Wisconsin has been blessed by God extraordinarily and unexpectedly. There were great fears in 1961 that we could not survive. And I just remember the great optimism of the 1970s, and that we became a national church body, and the interest in missions and all these things. And we are in a very difficult time now, but it's not because of those doctrinal issues. It's something far different financially, and I would say demographically. But even at that, the people who lived through this time had a sense, I always thought, somewhat like people who lived through the Civil War. You'd see these grainy videos of the last of the Civil War veterans. They would talk about a history that finally only they understood, and had their own personal moments of battle and personal sadnesses, and a sort of a wizened kind of outlook that the rest of us could just eavesdrop on. And so, but finally, I think that's all history can, that's one thing that history can always be. We get to eavesdrop, and we just have the hope that we eavesdrop as accurately as we can. So that's what I came to say, and I'd be glad to entertain some questions.